The Noise of Typewriters, Remembering Journalism. Auden famously wrote, "Poetry makes nothing happen. Journalism is a different matter." In a brilliant study that is in part a memoir of 40 years as an essayist and critic at Time magazine, Lance Morrow returns to the age of typewriters and to an extraordinary cast of characters. Delighted to be joining me live on the line, author of The Noise of Typewriters, Lance Morrow. Lance, good afternoon from us. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Pleasure is indeed all mine. The nature of journalism has changed dramatically since you first sat behind a typewriter back in the day. I mean, what? Tell us a little bit about how you came into journalism and your first sort of experiences.
Sure. Well, my parents were both journalists when they were younger, and so it was kind of the family business. I started working on a small town newspaper in Pennsylvania when I was during the summers when I was just 17. And then I went to the Washington Star for a year when between high school and college, and then back to the Star for a little while. And then eventually at the age of 25, I went to Time magazine, and I stayed there for 40 years. 40 years, so a long time. As I say, it was sort of the family trade. It was a different world, of course. It was a different America. It was a different world, and it was certainly a very different journalism. It was a lot of fun, actually. Sometimes a little grim and boring, but often a lot of fun.
I mean, we look at those titles like, you know, Time, Life magazine. I mean, these were things that were read by the majority of the population. They had gravitas, they had weight. They were how people got their news.
Well, not only got their news, but the Henry Luce publications. Henry Luce was the guy who started Time magazine in 1923, exactly 100 years ago. But not only the news, but Luce used those magazines to give Americans an idea of who they were and a sort of self-conception, because Americans are very self-conscious people, and they like to feel that they're good, and if they're not good, they must be pretty bad or even evil. And so Luce gave a huge part of the American population, the very broad American middle class, a sense of who they were. And this was very important for several decades in the middle of the 20th century. He was the son of I talk a lot about Luce in the book because I think he was extremely important. I call him the most consequential figure in American journalism in the 20th century. And so I dwell on him a bit, but he had immense impact on American policy and American ideas of who they were and what they ought to do in the world.
And not only that, with the format of Time, I mean, we are now used to the journalism of the soundbite, but you could write essays, you could write 5,000 words, 10,000 words, explaining a situation in a way that a newspaper perhaps couldn't.
Well, of course, Time was its whole thing when it was started out was brevity. It was news for busy men. It was men. It was the intended audience, but busy men in a busy world would get this digest of the news. But over time, over a period of years, it became, there was room to move around and to, I wrote essays for years and years, and on the back page of the book of Time magazine, and I was very lucky because I had room to move around, as you say, and to explore an idea at some not a great length, but more length than we used to have. And that was sort of a luxury. Um, Also, the quality of those magazines was quite high. The intellectuals hated them, tended to hate them for many reasons, including political reasons. But in fact, the quality of Henry Luce's magazines was really pretty high, and so it was. I was lucky. I myself was lucky to work for them in the period that I did, which was basically from 1965 to 2005, period of 40 years, which was the same amount of time that Luce himself had worked for Time Inc.
And of course, there's a cast of characters. I mean, you go back to the journalists of the 40s and the 50s, and they're like something out of a novel. It's almost Elmore James, isn't it? It's all rough and ready and hard drinking, partying, and but also getting the story out, and that noise of people thrashing away at a typewriter. Yeah, your style of writing was quite physical, I believe, as well. You describe your own writing style as sort of wrestling with a typewriter.
Well, my style, not necessarily of writing, but of typing, of addressing I write in the book a little bit about the different ways, the different physical ways that people would address a typewriter. And some were very physical. I tended to be kind of physical. I tended to pound a typewriter. Trained stenographers, of course, keep their elbows in close to their rib cage, and they are very economical with the energy expended and so on. But writers, newspaper people, and cops and people like that would just bang away at the things. And I loved the old mechanical typewriters. I never liked electric typewriters, but the mechanical typewriters would tolerate a great deal of eccentricity in the way that you smashed and banged and slammed them around. At the end of each line, your left hand would fly out and whack the carriage return and slam it back toward the right, and then you'd chick, you'd hit the keys until you'd done another line, and then your left arm would go out and you would slam the carriage back again to the right. And so it was a very physical business. The funny thing is my son is a newspaper editor and columnist down in Sydney, and I went to visit his newsroom at the Daily Telegraph down there a few years ago, and it's like an insurance office. It's like a mausoleum. There's no noise. You go in and you hear this very distant clickety click of the computer keyboard. Well, when I started out in newspapers, especially if it was on deadline, a newspaper newsroom was bedlam. There was 100 typewriters going bang, 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 bang. There were guys yelling copy, to get the copy boy to come and take the paper, your story, up to the city desk or the national desk. So it was a whole different atmosphere physically, and I sometimes miss it. It was fun. It was a young man's business, There was something sad about guys who got old in that business, where they smoked too much and they drank too much and they were getting old and they weren't paid enough, and they were worried about their mortgage and their lung cancer or whatever. And so that it was not good it was no country for old men, as they say, but to be young, in that atmosphere was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, there was the heady rush of a newspaper on deadline, and that level of smoke. I always say, because I briefly was on the Daily Mirror in the UK, and when I walked into the building at Holborn Circus, and it shows how old, you could smoke in the office, and there was a layer of smoke at about about 4 foot above the desk.
Right.
And the old men were the sub editors who were always looking at the timetables for the last train home, wherever they were going. That was the experience. But it mattered, because you were dealing with issues that mattered, and the way that America looked outwards and the way that America saw itself. And during the 50s and 60s and 70s, this was a period, to put it mildly, where America reevaluated itself in the world. And to be a journalist in America in the 60s meant civil rights, Vietnam, Johnson, Nixon, etc. I mean, that must have been a period where you were just going, this is an incredible period to be writing.
It really was. I started, as I say, I was very lucky in the period, in a period that was terrific for a writer. And I was working at Time just as Time was changing and becoming more, they started giving bylines to your stories and so on. But all those subjects that you mentioned, covering civil rights, covering the Vietnam protests, covering the war itself, covering the terrific turmoil. I was at the Chicago Convention in '68, the famous,
yes,
yeah. And I was standing. Let me tell you a story. I was standing on the corner of Michigan Avenue and Balboa Street, which is right by the lake there, and in front of the Hilton, where there was mobs of hippies and yippies screaming at the National Guard, and there was concertina wire and tear gas and everything. And this very dapper-looking fellow with press credentials around his neck sort of sidled up to me and said, "Hello, I'm Winston Churchill." And he stuck out his hand, and it was Winston Churchill. It was Randolph and Pamela Harriman, Churchill Harriman's son, Winston Churchill. And he was there covering it, looking very much like his grandfather, and very self-possessed and so on. And then a minute after he introduced himself, Mayor Daley released his cops, and they came pouring out of Balboa with their nightsticks in their hand, their long riot sticks, and they started beating heads. And so Winston and I fled, and I almost got bashed in the head. I didn't see him again. But anyway, it was an exciting, interesting time to be in that business. And
one of the things is the fact that during the 60s, you were pushing barriers. So you were something the status quo. So, journalism was supposed to be almost like a gentleman's sport, and war corresponding was a bit of an adventure. And so during the 60s, you had that clash between, Mayor Daley, who sent out the cops to beat up protesters during the Congress, during the Democratic Convention, etc. And they didn't have much media training, shall we say, during the 60s, which they would have now.
You mean the reporters didn't have much
and also the way that the authorities were reacting, because people would shoot from the hip. I mean, you wouldn't get a PR person in the way that now it is all control. I mean, Vietnam, for example, you had the daily briefings, and you had soldiers going out and reporters going out and speaking to anybody they wanted, basically, in a way that wouldn't happen now.
Exactly. It was Vietnam was an amazing case where all my friends, who were out there covering the war, they would just get up in the morning and they would go find a helicopter and they would climb aboard and they would spend the day under fire. The helicopter would go whumping off into the bush, and they might find themselves, their lives in danger. They're leaping off helicopters in a hot landing zone and so on. And as you say, there was no or very little effort to keep them contained. So one of the reasons that the country turned against the war was precisely the fact that the reporters were so free to move around the country and to see what was happening. And but I always found it bizarre that the reporters were able to circulate so freely in combat zones and so on. And then, of course, every day at 5 o'clock, the military command out at Tan Son Nhut Airport would conduct what they called the 5 o'clock follies, where they would give a briefing on how many Viet Cong they had killed that day, a figure that was almost always disputed, justly disputed, because it was often wildly exaggerated. And nobody believed the 5 o'clock follies. But anyway, that way of covering a war really undermined the American official version of what was going on in the war. And later on in Iraq, well, of course, in Iraq they allowed some reporters to be embedded with units, but anyway, it was wild and woolly in the way that, as you just suggested,
and not only that, I mean, it's also the images that came back, the still photography and the reports that came back, which were unbelievable. I mean, some of the stuff that Donald Feldstein was doing, all those guys, Don McCollum, just unbelievable photo reportage and proper reporting.
The photography was extraordinary. I knew a number of those guys, and they were just some of them were absolutely fearless. Tim Page, who died recently, Tim was crazy courageous. I mean, he was just absolutely nuts, the chances he would take. But Sean Flynn became legendary, and he, Errol Flynn's son, and Sean finally was killed. I mean, he disappeared across the border in Cambodia. But there was Eddie Adams, was Horst Foss. There were extraordinary guys out there.
I'm talking about extraordinary guys and breaking news, etc. I mean, close friend of yours is Carl Bernstein, and there can be no bigger, story of journalism and taking on, quote unquote, the man, the big government. I mean, it's become one of the biggest films of all time, but it really was an incredible. That's a defining moment for newspaper history, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, Carl and I started out on the Washington Star, a paper that doesn't exist anymore. But Carl and I were dictation typists together, and we were very good buddies, and we still are. I had lunch with him a few days ago, but I would never ever have said, I predict that Carl is going to become a world famous figure in journalism, but he was a very serious student of journalism, even at the age of 17 or 18. He was really a student of how it's done. And when he and Woodward came to Watergate, they had the genius, in a way, to approach it not as a political story or a big sort of statecraft story, but as a police story, just as a cop story. And so they knocked on doors, they talked to secretaries and so on. And it was indeed a police story. I mean, although it had worldwide implications in that it brought down a president and an administration. But Carl's a fantastic reporter, and it was fascinating to watch the way that he was transformed from a very obscure local reporter to a figure of international fame. I remember he was engaged a period in the early 70s, around 73, when he was engaged or when he was going with Nora Ephron, whom he later married, and we were sitting in a restaurant called the Dancing Crab up in northwest Washington.
Okay, yeah.
And three of us were banging away at crabs with hammers and so on, and having a wonderful dinner. And this guy who looked very much like a young Republican, a blue blazer, rep striped tie, clean white shirt, and very young Republican sort of guy, came up to the table. And of course, Carl had this rather long hair, this remnant of the 60s kind of. He looked, semi-hippie in his dress and so on. And this guy was on the White House staff. He was a young White House staff member. And I remember distinctly the way he came up to our table rather deferentially. And I thought, as I saw that, he said, Mr. Bernstein. He addressed Carl as Mr. Bernstein, this guy from the White House, who was working directly for Nixon. And I thought to myself, as I watched this happen, I thought, there is a transfer of power going on here. And I think maybe Nixon is cooked, because this guy suddenly had become deferential to a young reporter like Carl. And Carl, that is the press, that is the investigative arm of the press, had somehow become more powerful in this guy's subconscious mind than Nixon himself. And I thought it was kind of an interesting moment, because indeed it was a moment when Nixon, you could see Nixon losing his traction and becoming a little desperate. Mm. And you could see Watergate gaining on him and gaining on him. You could see Woodward and Bernstein gaining on him and gaining on him. And anyway, I marked it. The resignation began in my mind that evening
in the Dancing Crab restaurant.
In the Dancing Crab, in my perception of it, I just saw that at that moment something had changed. It dawned on me that for this very young Republican, very establishment guy from the inner circle of the White House came up, approaching Bernstein the way that in The Godfather, the guy approached Don Corleone. Yeah, Don, you do me. It was like that, and I thought, there's a transfer of power here.
The transfer of power, maybe, and that's 70s investigative journalism. Over in the UK, we've got Sunday Times, Howard Evans doing his thing at Howard Evans, but
yeah, right.
And now, how did we get here? It's got to be my next question, because now, I mean, was it the suits? Was it the business? Because you said earlier on, it's like it's like a very quiet typing pool, and no drinking, no smoking, nobody's doing the groundwork on. It's get the story out first without checking the facts. And you said a minute ago about the fact that the way they approached the story was like a police case, and people putting the shoe leather out there, and now it's bam, get it out there, bam, get it out there, and journalism should be a quote unquote a noble art, Lance. Yeah.
Well, there were a number of things. The business office had a lot to do with it. So did technology, and I mean, I remember a time when it dawned on when laptops came in. And say, and the business office, people began to think, and the editors who had to worry terribly about their budgets, all over the world, Time magazine, which had been very flush and made a lot of money, had bureaus: Moscow, Johannesburg, Buenos Aires, Paris, London, San Francisco, everywhere. They had bureaus, and every one of those bureaus cost a great deal of money. You had to have offices and secretaries and all kinds of expenses, millions and millions of dollars. And it dawned on these geniuses, say, why don't we close down the bureaus? And if something happens in Buenos Aires or Cairo or Johannesburg or some such place, all we have to do is buy a plane ticket for one correspondent and give him a laptop, have him go to the place, cover the story, file it from a hotel room, and then come back. And it costs a minute fraction of what they were paying for all these bureaus. And so gradually, or maybe not so gradually, they began closing the bureaus, and they saved a lot of money, but what they lost was a tremendous amount in the knowledge and the Rolodex and the expertise and the instincts that were possessed by a bureau chief and correspondents who were in place in that spot and who spoke the language maybe and who knew all the prominent players in the local and the national government and so on. So that was a beginning of that was an instance in which the technology made the business arguably more economical and more efficient, but at the same time had a damaging effect upon the quality of the journalism. And eventually, now you have a process. There are many things involved in this whole change, but now you have so much reporting done by overworked journalists who sit at their screens and they do their reporting with a mouse and with Google and hitting the websites instead of going and talking to government officials, for example. They'll go to the website of that mayor's office or that Department of State or whatever, and they will click on the whatever information they find on those websites. And furthermore, there's another change has to do with interviews. Very often, interviews which used to be face to face, where you could see the person you were talking to, and you could see the reactions, and you could follow a line of questioning and so on. Very often, these now are conducted by email. So you ask a politician for an interview, and the politician says, sure, but let's do it by email. So you send him an email, then his press secretary or his legislative aide will, they'll think about it and craft an answer. But what you're missing is obviously is spontaneity, and you're allowing them. They're almost lawyering their answers. They're how should I phrase this so that I don't get in trouble? Well, the spontaneity of the thing is lost, and also the sheer face-to-face quality, to be there, as you know as well as I, to be there, to actually be there, to see and feel the story is a huge part of doing journalism properly. And you lose that when you're not there, and you're doing it remotely. So technology has made very big changes.
I mean, it's all very well being able to do things from the click of a mouse, but if you're not on the ground and you just arrive, then you can be fed information from, you don't have sources. Yeah, and in terms of the interview, I want to know what the politician literally sounds like, smells like, his tics, because you get when the guy comes into an interview room, your spider sense goes off and you think, okay, he's a little nervous, he's a little this, he's a that.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly right. That's exactly right. There is really no substitute for being there.
And of course,
when you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to say and also because we now have news networks that seem to be leaning one way or the other, and we have social media, and people are saying, well, I get my information from here, and I try and tell people that it takes years to be an editor.
But these are connected, because people become more and more remote, and they will gravitate, that is remote from the reality of the story. And so they will gravitate toward an attitude toward the story, a sort of tribal attitude toward a particular story, where if you had people, more and more journalists who were actually covering it and bringing the complexity and, as you say, the real feel and smell of the story, to bringing that to the public, people wouldn't be so apt to fall into these, just tribal affiliations. They would think more for themselves instead of gravitating toward, in the United States, the MSNBC point of view or the Fox News point of view, the MSNBC being on the left and Fox being on the right, and being sort of, programs or programmatic kind of ways, even an atmosphere, and you sort of sign on to what tribe do you belong to, what team do you belong to, whereas the face-to-face, in-person, the old-fashioned thing does have the advantage of, or may have the advantage of, giving you much more complexity and less, party line kind of reactions.
We need to understand the subtleties, don't we? Because at the moment it's all being painted in black and white, and it's people shouting at each other, and you couldn't imagine a Watergate now because somebody said, "Oh well, you're just working for that paper. It's fake news. It's alternative facts."
That's a good point. It'd be interesting to see how that would play out.
That's the whole essay in itself. What do you hope that?
Yeah.
What do you hope? I'm going to run out of time, unfortunately, Lance, because I'm going to crash the news, and as you know, that's the cardinal sin. What do you hope that people will take from your book, The Noise of Typewriters?
Well, I hope a feeling for what journalism is and was. It's a sort of unusual book in that it's got a lot of different ingredients. It's not just war stories from the old days. It's, I think, more than that. Or I hope that it will cause them to think about the difference between then and now. But also, I hope that they will be entertained by it, because I tell a lot of stories that from a period that was very interesting, had an interesting cast of characters, and was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. As the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times. I know you have a website because I spent a considerable part of the time looking through it. So if people want to find you online, they can.
They actually, I'm very incredibly sloppy about that website. I if they want to look around for me, the best thing to do is just Google me, and there's a lot of stuff on there, articles and so on that I've done. So that's the better way. Just if they're curious, just Google my name, Lance Morrow, and they come right up.
They should be, because the book is absolutely brilliant. It's called The Noise of Typewriters, Remembering Journalism. It's by Lance Morrow. And Lance, can I just say, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this afternoon.
This has been a lot of fun. Thanks very much.